The sun had just dipped below the horizon when the quarrel began. Inside their modest home, Nora's stepmother was fuming. "You look just like your father," she spat at Nora. "Do you really think I'm so gullible that I'd believe your mother left you to be with my husband? How could a mother do something so cruel to her own child?" With a voice full of venom, she continued, "Get out of my house this very minute." The command was clear and harsh. Nora, her heart pounding with fear, fled from the house. She ran to the front gate, her steps quickened by the sting of rejection. As she sat down, the heavy rain began to pour, soaking her to the bone. The cold droplets mixed with her tears as she sat there alone, feeling abandoned and unloved. Earlier that day, Nora had tried to find a moment of warmth in her mother's presence. It was her birthday, and she hoped her mother might finally show her some affection. But in her mother's room, Nora watched with a heavy heart as her mother worked tirelessly, her attention consumed by paperwork and responsibilities. "Mommy, it's my birthday today," Nora said brightly, her voice trembling with hope. She had waited for this day, hoping for a bit of celebration or love. But her mother's response was far from what she had hoped for. She turned to Nora with a cold stare and replied, "Why should I care about that? Your birthday is the worst day of my life. It's a day I wish I could erase. You are my deepest regret, Nora. I wish you had never been born." Those words cut deep into Nora's heart. She stood there, crushed by the harshness of her mother's tone, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Her mother's eyes, usually warm and comforting, were now filled with a stark, chilling hatred. "Why do you always have to be such a burden?" her mother continued, her frustration evident as she pushed Nora away, ending the conversation abruptly. Heartbroken, Nora ran out of the house, her steps filled with despair. She climbed onto her small bicycle, the one she had cherished for years, and began to pedal away. The rain continued to pour heavily, and Nora's sobs were lost in the sound of the downpour. She rode aimlessly, not knowing where she was going but driven by the desire to escape the pain she felt. As she rode, the rain fell harder, making the road slippery and treacherous. Nora pedaled with determination, hoping to find some solace at the end of the road. The wheels of her bicycle spun tirelessly, each turn a way to escape the bitterness of her mother's words. She rode for what felt like hours, her strength waning but her resolve unbroken. Eventually, she reached a major expressway. The road was less crowded, and she decided to continue on it, hoping to find some relief. But her presence on the busy road was dangerous. The vehicle sped by, and Nora was barely aware of the danger she was in. Meanwhile, a young man named Mr. Duru was engaged in a heated argument with his wife over the phone. Distracted and agitated, he failed to notice the approaching figure of Nora on the expressway. Just as he looked away, his car collided with Nora. The impact was sudden and violent, and Nora was thrown from her bicycle, landing unconscious on the asphalt. Mr. Duru's heart raced with panic as he leapt out of his car. He saw Nora lying motionless and immediately felt a wave of dread. He quickly picked her up and rushed her to the nearest hospital, his mind racing with guilt and fear. At the hospital, the doctors quickly assessed Nora's condition. They informed Mr. Duru that she was in a coma and the situation was critical. Mr. Duru was overwhelmed with shock and guilt. As he sat in the hospital waiting area, his wife continued to call, accusing him of being unfaithful. She had no idea that their argument had resulted in such a serious accident. "Look at the mess you've made," Mr. Duru said to his wife over the phone, his voice filled with frustration. "I'm at the hospital with a girl I accidentally hit with the car." Mrs. Duru arrived at the hospital a short while later, her face pale with shock. She saw Nora lying unconscious on the hospital bed and was horrified by the situation. "We need to contact her family," Mrs. Duru said urgently, looking around in concern. However, Nora had no identification except for her bicycle. Let's check her bicycle, Mr. Duru suggested. They hurried outside and inspected the bike. To their relief, they found a piece of paper with an address taped to the side of the bicycle. This must be her home address, they said to each other as they hurriedly drove to the address. They arrived at a modest house and were greeted by Neka, Nora's mother. When they informed her that her daughter was in a coma, Neka's reaction was unsettlingly indifferent. Your daughter is in a coma, Mrs. Duru said with urgency. You need to come to the hospital. Neka's response was surprising. What do you want me to do about it? She asked, her tone dismissive. She then turned and closed the door behind her, leaving Mr. and Mrs. Duru bewildered. Mr. and Mrs. Duru looked at each other in confusion. Are you sure this is her mother? Mrs. Duru asked her husband, her frustration growing. How can she be so indifferent? As they returned to the hospital, Mr. Duru couldn't understand Neka's lack of concern. They waited anxiously for news, but hours passed and Neka never showed up. We have to go home now, Mrs. Duru said, her patience wearing thin. I can't stay here any longer. Mr. Duru, however, insisted on remaining. I can't leave her alone, he said. Despite his wife's protest, he stayed in the hospital overnight, praying for Nora's recovery. The next morning, Mr. Duru awoke to the sound of Nora sneezing. She had regained consciousness. Where am I? What happened? Nora asked, confused and disoriented. Mr. Duru explained, you were in an accident. I accidentally hit you with my car. You've been in a coma, but you're awake now. Your mother hasn't come yet. Nora looked worried. Where is my mother? She asked anxiously. Mr. Duru had to tell her that Neka had not yet arrived. Just then, Mr. Duru received a call from his wife, who was relieved to hear that Nora had regained consciousness. The doctors decided that Nora would need to stay in the hospital for a few more days to ensure there were no lasting effects from the accident. Mr. Duru took it upon himself to look after Nora's needs. He visited her daily, bringing her meals, gifts, and encouragement. His sense of responsibility grew stronger, especially given Neka's apparent lack of concern for her daughter's well-being. The day of Nora's discharge arrived, and Mr. Duru drove her home. To his dismay, he discovered that Neka had moved out of their house a few days earlier without leaving any forwarding address. They searched the area but found no trace of her. Feeling a sense of responsibility and compassion for Nora, Mr. Duru decided to take her in until they could find her mother or other family members. When Mrs. Duru saw Nora at their home, she was furious. What is she doing here? Mrs. Duru demanded. Why did you bring her to our house? Mr. Duru explained, Nora has nowhere else to go. She'll stay with us until we find her family. Mrs. Duru was enraged. You must be kidding me, she said angrily. Do you really think I'll accept this? I won't let you bring a stranger's child into our home.